you ready for this Q&A?
Yep, let's get into it.
The way we're going to go about is I have 3 sections. The first section is about choosing 2 options, this or that. And I'm going to give you a statement, and you sort of will have 2 options, and you will give me what is going to be your best answer to that. Next, we have overrated, underrated, as per usual, with some couple of controversial questions your audience and my audience have for you. Are you ready?
That's good.
Awesome. So the first part is this or that. For fat loss on a cut, or are you someone who prefers decreasing energy intake gradually, or do you prefer just to cut and right back to a very severe deficit?
I don't do it gradually in the sense of, stepwise 50, 100 calories per week or something. I go straight to the optimal deficit, which is usually not super severe. The leaner someone is, the greater the energy, or the lower the energy deficit has to be. So if someone's overweight, they can cut very fast. If someone's already very lean, they're in contest prep, you need to be very conservative, maybe even just a 5% deficit. But I go straight there. So if they go from, say, 5% surplus to 10% deficit, I go straight and make that jump in one go.
Okay. If we were to talk about partial or full ROM, what would you choose?
Full ROM for now, for most exercises. Lengthened partials are becoming super popular for probably good reason, because there are now a few studies that find that they are even superior to full ROM. But it's all in untrained individuals. And it's all on exercises that have a very pronounced sticking point at the top, such as calf raises, leg extensions. So I'm not super convinced that it's the way to go over full ROM. Most studies that look at partial versus full ROM still find full ROM is better. It seems to be mostly the lengthened part that's important. But I think if you're only doing the lengthened part, it's at least not necessary for exercises like Bayesian curls, lat prayers, where you already stimulate the lengthened position well anyway.
Okay. If we were to say for leg training particularly, is your preference doing full ROM, or do you prefer partials?
Partials can make some sense for leg extensions, for example, if your machine is not very good and it doesn't have great range of motion and a very nice resistance curve. Most leg extension machines are really only very difficult at the top when you extend the leg. And then partials might make sense. What I often do now in clients is I have the last set as partials, and before I do full ROM. One big downside I find of only using lengthened partials is that it becomes very difficult to track your progression, because what is half a rep, there's no marker to say whether the rep was full, and it becomes a very slippery slope. So it becomes very difficult to monitor your progression. And if you don't know if you're progressing, then you don't know if your program's working, which is very bad from our coaching point of view, because you can't optimize, you can't track.
Absolutely. Now, a follow-up question about mesocycles, and when you want to introduce a new exercise, for example, to your program, when is the best time to introduce this new exercise? Like, let's say you have been sticking to a program with specific exercises for the muscles you're trying to target, but for some reason you want to add a new exercise. When you want to add this new exercise to your program, when do you think is the best time to include it? At the end of your mesocycle, when you are kind of like in a deload phase where you're not necessarily adding or trying to see what the best RM is? Where would you put that exercise to kind of start getting familiar with it, practicing technique, then sort of like actually going right into it in your new program?
I think you can often just go right into it. When you want to introduce a new exercise, and then I'm assuming you have the volume for it, because of course if you introduce a new exercise, you have to know that either you're going to add volume or you're going to replace something else. Otherwise your volume might become excessive. But other than that, you can just put it whenever you want. Most research on these things find that if you're introducing it gradually for muscle soreness and these kind of things, it doesn't work any better. It does reduce the soreness, but it doesn't improve gains compared to going straight into it. And it does cost more time. Just as with the energy deficit, introducing exercise more gradually, it might be mentally easier for some people, but it does cost time. And research finds that it doesn't improve the results. So, if somebody's someone wants to do it gradually, that can be perfectly viable. But if someone doesn't have that desire, then you can just go straight in and use your time as optimally as possible.
Okay, so now wrist straps for improving obviously the capacity for lifting more weight, or trying to minimize the limiting factor of your forearms when you're lifting something. Are you pro or against these lifting straps in order to make sure you can give your best to perhaps like lat pull downs or rows or deadlifts? Do you like using straps like the figure eight or Versa grips, those kind of things?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of straps, especially for women, but they should not be necessary for most people for most exercises. In general, I would say deadlifts, very likely you will need them unless you have great genetics for powerlifting. Most people find that your body will outpace the growth of your grip, and most people are stronger with grips. There's also some research on that. And shrugs, also similar scenario, and especially for women where they typically have a more developed lower body compared to the upper body, it becomes very unrealistic to expect them to do Romanian deadlifts without straps, for example. Some exercises for women, sometimes even calf raises, if you need to hold like a 40-kilo dumbbell in your hands, that can be very difficult for women. And hip extensions as well, like if you are going up to 40 kilos and you have to hold it cradle to your chest, that can also be difficult for women without straps sometimes. Men typically shouldn't need it. Pull downs, maybe for high reps, but usually I find that when people need it for pull downs, unless sometimes when you're on gear, actually you can get extreme ratios in some individuals, but for most natural trainees, if you need straps for pull downs, usually I would say that's a sign your grip is very weak and you probably will benefit from grip training. I think it's good to use the straps in the meantime to make sure that your pull downs actually train your back instead of your forearms, but you should probably develop some more forearm size and strength to make sure you don't need them anymore, because at some point you'll start needing them for everything.
All right. Now, between these two options, what is your preferred option? Maingaining or actual building faces with large surpluses?
I'm definitely in favor of bulking. I favor ultra lean bulking, so very small energy surplus. But Maingaining, although the research is quite favorable on it, a recent study found actually that it was almost as effective as an energy surplus. My experience is that it's absolutely not. Yeah, I think it will work to a certain point for beginners, but an advanced individual, I don't know a single super advanced trainee who still grows muscle at maintenance. Like for most people, just nothing happens. I've tried it many times in clients that really want to make sure, I don't want to gain any fat. And I'm like, I don't think it will work, but we can try it. And they're like, no, let's just do complete maintenance, no energy surplus. And then after a couple months, it's like, well, you gained some strength, but really haven't gained any size, which means that you haven't gained muscle. And I've also tried it myself. It doesn't work anymore. Advanced trainees need to be in energy surplus.
Okay. Now, time of the day for training. Are you proponent of training better in the morning, midday, evening? What is best? Or is more reactive based on your energy levels?
I mean, the most best is, of course, when people have the time to train. But if someone has the luxury of choosing a training time, the most important thing, for one, is being consistent with that time, because your biorhythm adapts. And if you train sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, sometimes at 2, sometimes at 8, then your biorhythm cannot adapt and optimize your performance at that time. And there is now quite compelling research that performance will be lower, and also strength gains and sometimes even muscle hypertrophy can be lower. If you have the luxury of choosing a consistent time whenever you want, then I would favor the afternoons to early evenings. For most people, that's when performance is the highest because core body temperature is highest. If you always train in the mornings, and especially if you also use caffeine, the difference is very marginal. But there is at least one study by Kusma et al. From Scandinavia that found greater muscle growth when measured out over a period of 6 months in the group training in the afternoons versus the group training in the mornings. So it probably doesn't make a big difference, especially with caffeine in the mornings, regular training, but there is some research pointing that afternoons to early evenings are probably the most optimal.
Is there much difference when we refer to resistance training for hypertrophy, strength training for gaining strength, or cardio endurance training when it comes to picking the time, or is it's exactly the same for any type of training?
I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on endurance training. I think there is some research that the optimal time differs per training type, but the general trends that afternoons to evenings are better is similar. I think the ideal time is a bit different for swimming and running, for example, but it's not a huge difference.
All right. When we're sleep deprived, should you listen to your body or make your body listen to you? I know you made a post about this, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of making your body listen to you. I think a lot of people take it sounds, I mean, there's not really any research or anything to support it. It just sounds good to say, listen to your body. And of course, for some things, that makes a lot of sense, like pain signals. There's a lot of research verifying that listening to pain signals is a very prudent way to go about rehabilitation. However, for other things, it doesn't make any sense. For example, with dieting, most people listen to their body all the time. And that's why they get overweight. They eat when they're hungry, and they eat what they want to eat. What their body's like, oh, this seems good, and you eat that. So for a lot of things, especially when it comes to nutrition and sleep as well, your body's telling you at night, no, I'm not tired. I still want to do something. But the reason it's telling you that is because we have artificial light exposure. We are still exposed to more noise, higher stress levels, all of these things than in our ancestral times. So our body's natural way of functioning doesn't function optimally in our current circumstances. So when it comes to sleep and nutrition, often it is better to not completely ignore your bodily signals, but to optimize your environment to make sure that your bodily signals become signals that actually make sense. So in that sense, often with sleep deprivation, it is good to optimize your sleep, even if you don't want to go to bed, you don't feel tired, regular sleep cycle, high sleep quality. And then when you are tired, the next days, you can go to the gym and your performance is likely a lot better than you think, because the mental effects of sleep deprivation are much worse than the physical effects. The physical effects are more long-term, more cumulative effects, but the mental effects are already really bad sometimes after a single day, and then you might not want to go to the gym, you might not be feeling motivated to work out, but when you do go and you push yourself, you'll find that your strength is mostly still there.
The same question goes to general central and emotional fatigue. We know that fatigue can be very taxing when it comes to obviously challenge yourself and think about resistance training and giving your best at the gym and giving your best performance. When you feel like there is a lot of fatigue, it could be emotional fatigue, it could be actual mental fatigue or physical fatigue. How much should you listen to that fatigue in order to auto-regulate or make sure you are not putting at risk of doing something that is going to be mediocre and then injure yourself, or actually being able to get past this fatigue if it's not like hugely elevated and you're able to get a really good training session?
I think mostly you should try to push through it. And as you already say, it's very important to distinguish between different types of fatigue. So if it's actual neuromuscular fatigue, then you will witness in your performance that it's not there. Your strength is markedly lower. And if that's the case, probably you should do a reactive deload or not train at all, because you haven't recovered yet. But if you're just feeling emotionally drained or exhausted, that is a mental thing, and it often has nothing to do with your muscular state of readiness. There have been multiple studies that looked at subjective measures of readiness to perform, of perceived recovery status, and even in well-trained individuals that presumably know how to listen to their bodies, there is no relationship between these things, or there are extremely weak relationships between these types of subjective reports and actual performance. And interestingly, what I've also found myself very strongly, research finds that the relationship is completely different before and after the warm-up. So sometimes you may feel terrible, but then when you go into the gym, you do your warm-up, and then you find that all of that mental fatigue is pretty much gone, and you're not stressed anymore because you were thinking about something else, or whatever was fatiguing you is not there anymore. Maybe you're just doing something else. Just any variation often is really good for ridding yourself of mental fatigue. And after the warm-up, you realize that you're ready to go, and you can just do a workout as normal.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, thinking fasted or fed training, which one is best?
I would always advocate fat training. We have actually a study on this coming up soon. Can't share details yet, but there was a recent study on Ramadan fasting, which of course also has water fasting in it, or fasting without water. I always get confused when people say water fasting and it means that you are drinking water. It's like, doesn't that mean that you shouldn't drink water? Anyway, the research on fasted training is generally negative, finding possibly reduced effects on performance, reduced effects on anabolic signaling, and thereby long-term muscle growth. Even protein is likely most important to have, because then it already starts the anabolic signaling, and your body, mTOR, for example, can already see that, hey, we have amino acids, there is hyperaminoacidemia. Therefore, if we combine that with the signal of the strength training, which is mechanical tension in the muscle fibers, then the body has an optimal signal and the means to produce muscle growth. So that's what you want, and you want to have that already as soon as you are working out or right after the workout. There's even one study which found that just carbohydrates compared to nothing, not even protein, improved muscle growth compared to training fasted. And they were only fasted for a couple hours in that study. So generally I would recommend that you sandwich your workout between a 5-hour intermeal window. So if you think of this as 5 hours, then the workout should be in between. And you can move them around. You can eat right before the workout and then 5 hours later, or you can eat a few hours before the workout and then right afterwards. That's all fine. You can move around that window, but you should eat, within a few hours before and after the workout.
Okay. Do you recommend a specific ratio, carbohydrate, protein, before and after, or does it matter as much, or much matters the total amount of protein you consume at the end of the day? And same for carbohydrates. Like, do you want to prioritize some carbohydrate prior and after for recovery and for performance, or are you thinking that there is a specific ratio that is best to think about?
The daily totals are definitely most important, but the amounts pre and post workout are also relevant. And for carbohydrate intake, interestingly, we conducted the first systematic review on this quite recently, and we found that just 15 grams pre-workout is, in the vast majority of context, enough to maximize performance. Like, it does seem prudent to have some carbs as opposed to nothing, but even 15 gram net carbs seems enough under even ketogenic conditions to make sure that workout performance is pretty much optimal. And for protein, I recommend at least 0.4 gram per kilogram, usually good 20 gram high quality protein, something like that. And that's enough to maximize in a fasted state at least. It's enough to maximize muscle protein synthesis. And then after the workout, you probably want more. You probably want 0.6 gram per kilogram or more, because in the anabolic window, which is basically the whole period of muscle growth after the workout, not just right afterwards, in that anabolic window, there's a delay in muscle fullness, which means that you can use more protein to build muscle. It's basically the body's way of allowing you to build more muscle. But you're not going to get that muscle growth unless you have the protein. So basically you want more protein in the periods after the workouts than before to maximize muscle protein synthesis.
Do you think carbohydrate post-workout makes any benefit to not just recovery per se of the muscle glycogen, but also in terms of like somehow supporting hypertrophy in a way, or not necessarily?
Probably very, very little. A few studies have looked at this, and they find that protein makes carbs pretty much redundant, because carbs only matter for endurance training. It does matter, because then the glycogen depletion and muscle damage actually seems to be associated with the adaptation of building greater endurance. For strength training, it doesn't matter. It's just substrate depletion, and that's not part of the actual stimulus of muscle growth, because muscle growth is not about being able to produce more energy like endurance training is. So research finds that for strength training, it doesn't matter if you're glycogen depleted after the workout. For endurance training, it does. And the reason that carbs in isolation do have an effect on muscle growth is because of insulin, which is anti-catabolic, and it reduces muscle protein breakdown. But insulin is also stimulated by protein. So protein is not just anabolic, but also anti-catabolic. And therefore, if you have protein, studies by Staples and Koopman found that protein basically makes the carbs unnecessary. You already get maximum decrease in protein breakdown and maximum increase in muscle protein synthesis. Adding carbs to that doesn't do anything further.
Let's move to over and underrated. And the first question I've got for you is strength training in children or just children in general overrated or underrated?
Definitely underrated. There are a lot of concerns about it stunting growth and just that it's harmful somehow. And that's not true at all. Strength training is very healthy. In fact, per minute of exercise, there are a few studies, including a new one, that find that it can be healthier than endurance training. And for children as well, I think it's super good to already get them exposed to not just endurance type training, but also to strength training, pretty much as soon as they're interested in it. Just emphasize good technique above all else, because children, of course, can be a bit more wild than if you train an adult. But other than that, it's perfectly fine. And even pre-pubertally, they can already build some muscle and lose some fat, which is generally good for their health, plus all the other associated health benefits of exercise, of course.
Is there any particular age that you would say don't lift or do any weight before this age, or it doesn't really matter?
I don't think so, no. I think you can basically start lifting as soon as the child can, in terms of motor skills, do it, and they're interested in it, then it's fine to do it.
Okay. Now, activity snacks, overrated or underrated, and what they are?
I guess underrated because they're still very unknown, but the idea is, I don't think they're that effective in most practical settings, but there is a recent study that found that they can actually stimulate muscle protein synthesis, because most of us are, even when we go to the gym, are quite sedentary most of our time. And that means that muscle protein synthesis levels are also quite low. And this recent study found that if you do activity snacks, which is basically just being active for a couple minutes, some bodyweight squats or some very light activity, that's enough to actually stimulate a bit of muscle protein synthesis. And it's also good to stimulate blood flow, tissue turnover. There's other research that it can promote active recovery. So maybe it has a little bit of use. I think if you're not completely sedentary, like bed rest level, then it's going to be a small effect. I think most of the effect, just if you do, especially if you do at least some type of exercise every day, and you're not ultra sedentary, I think it will be a very, very, very small effect. But it is interesting, and I'm curious to see more research to see if that type of active recovery can not just improve recovery, but also muscle growth directly.
Okay. When we think about these activity snacks, are we specifically referring to a specific amount of time, a specific type of intensity, a specific type of exercise? What I've heard is that it could be very, very short time, even like 3-5 minutes, but you try to go as intense as you can, just to increase that energy output and that breathing capacity. But I am not sure so much about what's the benefit of this at the level of someone that probably doesn't have the capacity to move that athletically to get to that level of intensity. But what is your stance on this particularly? And when we think about length intensity, what would you think about or prescribe for this exercise snack?
I think it can be very low intensity and pretty short as well. It's mostly about stimulating blood flow and just making the tissues active. It's not so much about actually stimulating muscle growth, because you're using your workouts for that. Plus, you're not warmed up, and also in practical purposes, if you're sweating multiple times a day, that's very inconvenient. The study that we have looked at bodyweight squats, and I'm not sure what the other thing was. I think it was just maybe general activity, brisk walking or something. But there's, in terms of active recovery, there is also some research that bench pressing with, for example, 30% of 1RM or even 16%, and then just doing a few repetitions, you can already get the effect. Okay. So I think it can be quite light. Maybe it's better to do bodyweight squats than just walking, but I think even walking is already providing quite some of the effect.
Okay. Now, thinking about collagen and the supplementation when we're trying to prevent injuries, is it for you, is this overrated or underrated?
I think super overrated. I'm extremely skeptical of the use of collagen in settings where people already consume enough protein and vitamin C because the body can make its own collagen. And the whole narrative of collagen being effective to support our joints, bulletproof your knees, all that stuff, it doesn't make any sense. It's not like you consume collagen and it just goes from your mouth, through your body, into the joint. It gets broken down. It's essentially just protein. It's gelatin. It's broken down in just like other protein sources. And then there is an argument to be made that it's higher in certain amino acids, like proline, that are rate limiting for collagen synthesis. But I think if you have a sufficient total daily protein intake, it's going to be, you're already covering that. And some of these amino acids aren't even essential to begin with. So yeah, I'm super skeptical of that research. Like the mechanism doesn't make a lot of sense. There's direct research showing that there's no increase in collagen synthesis in bone, in total body, in muscle connective tissue after consuming collagen. Like even that finding is mixed, right? Even just whether there is actually, not even equating for protein intake, vitamin C intake, just the fact when you consume collagen, is there actually an increase in collagen synthesis in the body? That's already being debated. And then when we get to the point of long-term findings, pretty much all the positive findings in collagen are sponsored by the supplement industry. You can almost always trace them back even to one specific company from Germany, which is called Gelita. And they found, like all the research, surprisingly, that finds positive effects. And basically all the independent research finds at best super mixed, inconsistent, weak effects.
If you were to think about what's the harm of consuming it, in case that we see people still supplementing, those who have an injury or recovering from an injury or are going through a rehab process, is there harm to supplement? Would you recommend it, or would you say, like, look, just focus on the quality of your diet, focus on eating adequate amount of protein, maybe a little bit more than what you normally would do, and make sure you have plenty of vitamin C? Would you supplement with vitamin C instead and good amount of protein, or what would be your best recommendation when it comes to this?
I think just overall healthy diet, omega-3s do show some promise, sufficient protein intake, so at least 1.8 gram per kilogram is what I recommend for strength trainees, and enough vitamin C. That should not be an issue at all. If your diet's good, has veggies and fruits, then you don't need to supplement it. In fact, most supplements contain so much that it can interfere with muscle growth because it's excessively anti-inflammatory. That occurs usually only when you take a gram or more, which is almost 10 times the RDA for untrained individuals. So for trained individuals, still over 5 times that. So yeah, I wouldn't go that route. And collagen, I think it won't do anything. If you consume some gelatin, for example, at least that's cheap and it's filling and it's food. So I wouldn't be opposed to that. But spending money on expensive collagen supplements, I think, is not going to be worth it for most individuals or anyone.
What do you think about the protein water? Like these collagen waters and that flavor things that just contain more protein. Is that beneficial for any particular population? Has that any benefit apart from just adding some more expensive water? But what is your take on this?
Yeah, I wouldn't see much use compared to, say, whey shakes or collagen protein, like gelatin specifically. I think it's mostly marketing to settle another new product.
Yeah. Okay. Now, body weight exercise for muscle growth, overrated or underrated?
Underrated. It is true that bodyweight exercise is sometimes difficult to do intensely enough, as we'll experience during the COVID restrictions. But there are a lot of ways that you can be much more creative than most people are. For push-ups, for example, most people are like, oh, when I can do a certain amount of push-ups, even 20, they think, I can't use it anymore. But research finds that you can safely go up to 30 reps as long as you go to failure, and it's still maximum muscle growth. On top of that, you can elevate your feet, you can use the deficit, you can perform on your knuckles, you can use the diamond grip, you can even do them on one arm, you can do suspended push-ups, and then you can combine all these things. You can also put weight on your back, you can use a band, you can use chains, tons of things you can do to make it more difficult. Same with, well, chin-ups are hard enough for most people already, but the same is true for chin-ups, many other exercises. I recently did a video on the YouTube on hamstrings exercises that people don't know. There are a lot of type bodyweight type leg curls, for example, that are actually very useful, especially when you don't have a leg curl machine. So I think they're super underrated. And research generally also finds that they're at least as effective, even at relatively low intensities. There are studies, 2 or 3 studies, at least 2, on push-ups versus bench press, showing that they're equal for pec size growth. And there are studies on like single leg squats being equally good as back squats, for example. So many people have these ideas of the barbell lift being superior and necessary, but that's not true at all. As long as you can stimulate enough tension in the target musculature, then any type of exercise in principle can do the job, and body weight is super useful.
Would the technique itself and the tempo of execution of those exercises would make a difference in terms of the effectiveness of these body weight exercises? For example, if you're doing a pull-up and you're focusing on the eccentric, really slowing down and focusing on that eccentric and that last stretch, would that make a difference if you're just doing pull-ups for as fast as possible, or just for the sake of getting more reps?
I think pull-ups won't be inherently different than pull-downs. Yeah. But you can definitely use tempo and mind-muscle connection even to make bodyweight exercises harder if you don't have weight. For example, if you do chin-ups but you don't have a dip belt and you don't want to put a dumbbell in between your thighs or ankles, then you can use tempo to make it more difficult and make sure that it's still heavy enough for you. So that's certainly a good application.